Hi everyone, it's me and welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Tapiwa and I make bookish content here on YouTube. And in today's video, we're going to be wrapping up our month of October reads. I'm going to be talking about all of the books that I've read or started to read in October. Some of them I did finish in November. Disclaimer. For the genre breakdown of this month, we have one fantasy, one non-fiction, one historical fiction, one thriller, one classic, and one literary fiction. So we have a bunch of different genres in there for this month. So let's get into it. The first book that I read this month was Tuesdays with Morrie by Mitch Albom. The premise of this novel is essentially following a very successful journalist living in America that has given up a lot of his life to his work and to his career and to success. And before he achieved all of these things, he had a professor in university that was someone who instilled certain values in him, which he now has lost due to his success. He discovers that this professor has been diagnosed with a terminal illness, and in an attempt to reconnect with his own self and to live a better life, to honor the memory of his beloved professor, he begins to spend every single Tuesday with his professor during what are his last days. This book was interesting. I didn't really know what to expect when I went into it. I know a lot of people have spoken about it, but I genuinely enjoyed this book. I would say that it's fun in the sense of the amazing discoveries that Morrie, who is the professor, imparts onto his student. And you know, for the most part, there are things that we learn about growing up in life. Things like love other people, and the overall sentiment being that you should live every day as if it is your last because nothing is guaranteed. And Morrie, our professor, is facing the end in a very brave way, in a way that is very honest and vulnerable and is not putting up a front of being 100% courageous. He does have his anxieties, he does have his fears, but he looks towards his life with gratitude and he takes every single day a step at a time. I'd say this book is written for everyone. Honestly, I would recommend this book to every single person because death is something that we all are going to have to face at some point or another, and this book shines such a bright light on that experience and on how it might not be pleasant or even physically accommodating to descend into that state and to prepare for that and to know that it's coming. For most people, we're not going to die in a very sudden way. So the act of preparing for death is not only something that you can do once you have been diagnosed, but something that you can do in your day-to-day life. And I think that that's what this book really equips us as readers with the fervor to look towards life in a more appreciative way, in a way that understands that time is limited, but at the same time the things that we do every single day count. The depiction of death in this book was very honest. It really is something that is a bleak subject, but because of Morrie's outlook on life and how he allows himself to feel pity and feel despair and feel pain, and as his physical abilities are slowly slipping away, he doesn't really let himself wallow too much in his situation, as bad as it gets. You know, every single day, as much as he can, he's out of the door. Even as he cannot eat food anymore, he still maintains a hope for the future, a brightness of spirit. And the information that we receive throughout the book is extremely vast, covering the entire human experience, from friendships to marriage to life choices to aging to success to money. He covers a lot of different topics, and some of them do feel a bit like fluff, but I think because we have the background of Morrie's impending death in this novel, his words do seem a lot more meaningful, because you know that a man has passed away with these sentiments on his heart and on his soul. So this book is actually a non-fiction book. It's 100% real, and it was written by Mitch, who was truly Morrie's student. Before I started reading this, I thought it was a fictional story, and it just makes it that one bit more real, knowing that Morrie was actually a professor and he really did share these sentiments as we are reading them in the book. It might be a bit left field, but this book really reminds me of East of Eden by John Steinbeck. I feel like these two books have a very similar main theme of acknowledging the choices that we have in our lives and empowering us as people to choose good. You know, in East of Eden, there's the idea of Tim shall, or thou mayest, but in this book there's the idea of virtues that you can add onto your life before it's too late in order to live a good life and to die peacefully as well. I know some people say this book is a bit cliche, but honestly I enjoyed this book a lot and I would 100% recommend it. So the next book that we're going to be talking about is Katabasis by R.F. Kuang, and this is a fantasy / dark academia book which follows two graduate students as they descend into hell to rescue their professor. And in this story we are essentially with the students in hell, discovering the different courts, facing many different challenges, and also making a lot of commentary and critique on the system of academia, the system of higher education, how hard graduate students work and the lack of compensation, the sexism that exists within academia, and with a small, not necessarily important emphasis or subplot, including a romantic story. And I think maybe from that romance you could say that it is exploring the idea of miscommunication. I would not say that they're enemies to lovers, because I don't think they ever were enemies. It just felt very much miscommunication that had happened between them, and once they did communicate, things improved in their relationship. So I feel like it was more miscommunication than enemies to lovers, but it has been marketed as an enemies to lovers book. For this book I gave it 2.5 stars. That is for various reasons. There were a lot of elements of this book that I genuinely enjoyed, mostly stemming from the philosophy, the logic, the mathematics, more of the scientific elements of the book I gravitated towards and I found very insightful. The number of philosophers that I have to research just from reading this book is insane. I have so many tabs. Most of these are just like things I need to research for myself because she mentioned so many amazing and interesting things. But outside of the intellectual aspect of the novel, I found the actual plot itself to be quite a drag. I didn't really feel engaged with the traverse through hell. It felt quite long and in some places very boring. And even when it came to the critique of academia, we were receiving this critique from the voice of a very unlikable character, Alice Law, who in many ways believes that she is the exception and deserves a lot of good things, and she does work hard for them 100%, but in most of her discussions around other people, whether it be other women or other magicians, she has a very poor view of them. I feel like she just is, for me, I know there's no such thing as the perfect victim, but for the critiques that she was trying to make, they never really landed because she felt very wishy-washy. And I understand the idea of exploring maybe a Stockholm syndrome of sorts, but it just never really got to a point where I felt as though Alice's breakthrough in terms of what she had suffered and her own beliefs didn't really come, so her character development for me felt quite flat. I understand that R.F. Kuang was trying to test the bounds of the imperfect victim, and that is a very interesting position to explore, but I just feel like not enough care and effort was put into Alice and her narrative in order for us to feel it was believable, because I'm someone who I try to leave my biases at the front door and I kind of give the author space to convince me of what they are trying to get to. But with this book, I could not believe what was trying to be put forth. Even though this book is marketed as a fantasy book, it really lacked a lot of fantastical elements. We do have a magic system that is based on chalk, and I absolutely love the magic system. I almost wish we had expanded more into the incantations and the spells and the pentagrams and the requisite loops. Like, I wanted more information on the magic system, but we didn't really get into that. We more so got into a little bit of the lore of hell. Just didn't really grip me as much. Maybe if it had more fantasy imbued in hell itself, I would be more interested, but it didn't really grip me as much as I was hoping. And I think that when it comes to Katabasis, the one thing that I'm particularly upset about is that I feel as though it could have used a lot more editing in terms of Alice's character, in terms of the actual plot, in terms of some moments of the writing. It needed to be edited more, and it needed more work. That's just my opinion. Maybe someone else doesn't feel that way, but there were so many things that could have connected that didn't, and so many moments where this book just was on the cusp of greatness. And I feel like a few more cycles of editing would have taken it to an entirely different space. And I also watched reviews when people received arcs of this book, and I think there's just a lot of common sentiment around this book feeling like it needs a little bit more work. It's hard to say whether I would recommend this book or not, because it doesn't really fall perfectly into an audience group. It is a romance, but it also has fantastical elements, but it has academic elements, intellectual, philosophical elements. So it touches on a lot of different things. I think I would recommend it to someone who is intellectually curious, just someone who just enjoys expanding their mind and enjoys certain things, but also because I feel it requires a bit more work. I don't know if I would be readily willing to recommend this book, but there's still so much that I learned from this, and so much that this book affected me in such a good way, but it was lackluster in so many other ways as well. And if you want more of my thoughts on Katabasis, I have a fully dedicated reading vlog, so you can explore this book with me as I go from extremely excited to extremely disillusioned by the end, if that's something that you want to see. The next book that I read in October was Girl, Woman, Other by Bernardine Everisto, and this book was actually the Booker Prize winner in 2019, and that is largely the reason why I picked up this book. I also had a desire to read a feminist novel, so that's why I was drawn to this book. And the point of this book essentially follows about 12 different Black British women, and we get a little glimpse into each of their lives, and for some of these women, their stories are intertwined, and we get to the end and understand that in one way or another that these women's lives are kind of touching on each other, and they kind of branch out as sort of a tree in this very interesting and humanizing way. I feel as though the point of this book is to explore the many different expressions of Black womanhood in Britain, and that honestly it spans decades and decades. This book crosses many generations, and we honestly get to follow some very interesting characters that also tell, through their own experiences, tell the story of history, British history, Nigerian history, Caribbean history. So there's a lot of history that is part of this novel, which I genuinely appreciate. And as you can imagine, because I said that this is a feminist book, it follows feminist issues such as motherhood, sexuality, issues also such as racism, poverty, classism, abusive relationships, not just heterosexual but homosexual abusive relationships, religion, for a lot of the women's stories we follow, love, the concept of love, the idea of love, whether that be friendship, queer, straight, many different things, love that's discovered later on, love that is lost, children, lots of different expressions of love are explored through the stories of these women. And as much as this book has such a rich depth of experience, there were just some moments where I didn't want to continue reading, because for me the writing was very journalistic. It didn't feel like it pulled me in. I think looking back now, I've had quite a few days since I've read this. From a bit of distance I can actually put the pieces of the significance of this novel together a bit more. But in the moment when I was reading it, it just was not a fun reading experience. And I feel like that took away from it from me, because I wanted to enjoy what I was reading. Even though the stories were interesting, the writing itself was tough for me to get through, and it made it a lot more boring in my opinion. What I found fun in this book was there was one particular character who I not necessarily relate to, but would like to relate to, would aspire towards. And I just thought that she was someone that I could see myself in, and that's always just such a beautiful thing, to relate to someone and to have some sort of small representation. And I think that's why a book like this is super interesting, because different stories about different women, about different people need to be told, and that was just one of the beauties of this book. Genuinely, the narration of this book felt like it dragged it down in so many different ways. But another issue that I did pick up with this book was that even though we are exploring unique identities of Black womanhood existing in Britain, there were some moments where I felt like the characters only existed to represent certain points of marginalization. And like I said, representation is 100% important, but I feel like when presenting a sort of character that is marginalized, I feel like they should be treated as a fully fledged human being, not just as a vessel of pushing that certain experience onto us. I 100% want to read about all of the many different ways that Black women suffer in society, not in a bleak way, but just in a more acknowledging way. But I feel like it would be more meaningful if the characters were fully fledged and not just existing to tick off a box of marginalization groups. Overall, for this novel, I gave it 3 stars. Looking back on it, I think I'm happy with that rating. And if you do want to see my real-time thoughts on this book, I actually have a 24-hour readathon video where I'm reading this book. So if that's something you're interested in, please go check that out. The next book that I read in October was The Family Upstairs by Lisa Jewell, and this is a thriller book. I really like the gold. And this novel follows a wealthy family living in Chelsea in London, and we have a dual timeline essentially comparing their life of wealth and decadence to their current scenario, where we are following an unknown 25-year-old woman who has just come into inheritance of this amazing house that belonged to this incredibly wealthy family in the past, and we shuffle between the past and the present in order to discover what happened and why things are the way that they are right now. And because we are following a multiple timeline, we actually have 3 different characters' perspectives that we view the story from. First character is our narrator, and that is Matty, I believe that's his name, who is our narrator. And we also have Libby, who is the 25-year-old, and we have Lucy, who is a woman who also has connections to this house. This book was incredibly quick to read. The font is quite large in the novel, so it goes by quite quickly, which I enjoyed. Sometimes thriller books can be engaging, intriguing, insightful, but this book really wasn't that, but at least it was very quick to get through, and it was also incredibly easy to read. The language was pretty decent, not too difficult. The words flowed into each other quite well, and that's something I appreciate. You know, sometimes when you're reading a book like this, maybe it goes by quite quickly and you don't really have to exert too much knowledge into even trying to understand the language. Maybe you're like focusing on solving the mystery, but for me there really wasn't much of a mystery or any sense of intrigue in this book. A lot of that thriller element fell flat. It didn't really meet my expectations in that regard. Not only in the sense of the thrill, the meaning or the sort of like huge reveal that is gradually showed to us as we're reading felt very lukewarm. I didn't believe it, and it didn't make any sense. And I feel like when you're reading a thriller book or even a horror book, the most important thing is belief. Belief is what's going to take you from moving your eyes across the page to actually feeling that sense of thrill, excitement, engagement. In my opinion, the vibes were lackluster. I didn't really feel at any point drawn into it, but the reading experience was very good or okay. I guess I could say that I was not deterred from continuing reading. So it was just this combination of good and lukewarm that kind of in the end turned out to be something that was okay enough to follow. And I guess this is a bit of a spoiler, but it is revealed to us that the family is participating in a cult. And that is the reason why they have lost this amazing house and all of their wealth to some extent. And the idea of a cult is interesting and honestly can be done well. But I just didn't feel like I understood why they were giving up so much of their freedoms. Their mindset and their beliefs and why they did what they did was not explained to me in a very believable way. It just was kind of like, oh, we say we're a cult, so automatically you shall do what we say. There was no real belief on my part that anything that the cult was doing was even remotely cult-ish or engaging or fearful or scary. There was just nothing that held the story together, in my opinion. In terms of the characters themselves, they were captured as well as you could, considering the fact that there were so many different characters and so many different voices and narrators. It kind of takes away from how much you can explore with each individual character. But as far as we explored them, which wasn't that deeply, they kind of exist within their realms of like the pretty aloof boy or the impressionable young girl or the mean stepmother. Those sort of tropes that you get. Maybe even the charismatic leader. So the characters kind of exist in their boxes and they don't really extend outwards, but it's not in a way that's something that I want to critique. I can't even describe where the book lost me because I don't think it ever had me. So all in all, I think it was a mediocre read. I still gave it 3 stars because I wasn't pulling my hair out while reading it. So I feel like for me, reading enjoyability, how much I enjoy reading, almost matters a huge amount. But because I didn't hate the reading experience, I still ended up giving it 3 stars. The next book that I read for October was The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck. And this book is a classic and it's also a historical fiction that follows the Jewell family as they travel from their farm in Oklahoma as tenant farmers to the great land of California, where they want to make a life for themselves, picking fruit in the closest thing to what can be called a paradise on earth. This book in many ways is a very deep and interesting commentary on capitalism, on exploitation, on the American spirit and the capitalist spirit of competition and greed. It also comments on poverty, on the family, on togetherness, on groupthink, on religion. Honestly, it just comments on so many different things, but the main critique of this is the exploitation of workers and people in the system of the American dream and how that is a very false institution and quite frankly doesn't exist. As we follow this family, so many different elements are revealed to us, and I think one of the most important elements that is put forth is the idea of community and being a human and helping other humans, and the way that a family can orient itself around values such as sharing and kindness and offering and feeding one man, and how living in a society where people are pitted against each other, groups are taught to hate each other, where money is scarce, where jobs are scarce, where land is taken, natural values such as family and community begin to erode. And it's just, I think until the end, this book tries to push an image or an idea of family and community and helping one another, helping your neighbors, being good to your neighbors, the idea of the human spirit versus, say, the religious spirit or the corporate spirit. This book also discusses the history of America and how in different eras of American history, the right solution or the prize or the goal in which the people fought towards was simple and straightforward, not necessarily easily won, but there existed a paradise, there existed a winner. Say, fighting against Native Americans. Of course, that's not something I condone, but in that situation, there was a winner and there was a loser, there was a goal. But in this situation of greed, of capitalism, it's just this never-ending struggle to make it through a day, to get a job and to work and to put food on the table, but you barely have enough food to think of your future. There is no future. It's a very bleak book, to be honest. And I found it to be incredibly interesting. I found the story to be at some points amazing and engrossing, and at other points quite difficult to get through. John Steinbeck is an amazing author, and I still do believe that, but the writing in this was at times very long-winded, and the accents that the people had were hard to get through at moments, and there was a lot of technical discussion of tractors and machinery and cars, and being that this book was written about the time of post 1900s, it does make sense that a lot of more physical and manual terminology and techniques and instruments were in use at that point in time. But reading about the intricate details of what it takes to fix a car, to make a car, to push a tractor, it really took me to a place where I didn't want to be, because I'm not fully interested in those sort of things. So I resonated with the overall message, but for me this was a very difficult book to read. And in the book we have, as I mentioned, the Jewell family, which is headed up by their grandfather, and then they have their father, and they have Tom and Al, which are two brothers. There's also Noah, who's another brother, and you have Rosa Sharon. She is the sister, and you have two little kids, Winnie and Ruthie, and you also have Grandma and Ma. So literally I remember everyone because you get to know these characters so intimately, so intricately, and that's something I love about Steinbeck, is he never holds back in his detail. And honestly, each and every single one of these characters stands out in my mind as an individual, and that's something that I genuinely appreciate, is his characterization and his ability to very masterfully portray characters which feel very human and are very human. Just so much love for his characters and the things that they represent, and the entire familial dynamic that every single character plays into is just amazing for me. And we get to witness how the dynamic of the family sort of rests upon the shoulders of the patriarch, and as they move more and more into poverty, it becomes a situation where we move into a bit more of a matriarchal society, because the mothers and the women are having to step up and to feed the family, and the act of feeding becomes paramount to their survival. So the women are seen now as the heads of the home to make the decisions, and that kind of reversal of the gender roles existing in a state of flux, in a state of despair, disaster, is just very interesting to see. And it's nothing that Steinbeck outright points out or says, it's just kind of something that is observed through the shifting of dynamics and how the characters interact with each other, which is, for me, was a very interesting comment. And as I mentioned, this book is set in around post 1900, because we have things like Ford, we have banks that are reclaiming land, we have a great American road trip. So we kind of set across the more colder, wetter environment of Oklahoma, moving into a drier, more severe atmosphere of California, and that is our setting in this novel. Very much a road trip book. I feel like I didn't go into it with enough knowledge of how the book is written. It kind of follows this idea of each chapter existing as one chapter moves the plot forward, and then the next chapter will have like a sort of poetic, in some sense, vignette of a depiction of the lives of people, the lives of the migrants that were moving to California, the things that they suffered, and small little tales of their struggles, which I found really interesting overall, because we got to explore the Jodes, but we got to explore the moment in its entirety in many different ways through those chapters, and each chapter would focus on, say, one would focus on farming, one would focus on road trips, one would focus on stopping during the road, one would focus on music, one would focus on living in a slum. So, you know, many different short topics were focused on in those poetic chapters, which I genuinely enjoyed. This book inspired me to learn more about American history, about the Great Migration. I didn't even know that it was a thing, that people suffered from discrimination going from certain states into California. I didn't know that they were forced to leave to California. So that is something that I'm super excited to have learned about. I didn't know about the term Okies and its negative connotations. But overall, this book was very difficult to read, and I'm very proud of myself for finishing it. I do want to push myself to read difficult things and not just give up because I'm finding it tough, but just allow myself to be challenged. But because of that reduced ease in reading, I decided to give this 4 stars. Genuinely like this book, and it challenged me, which I appreciate. And if you're interested in my thoughts, Grapes of Wrath, I have a reading vlog, a 24-hour reading vlog where I read that book, so you can check that out if you want. And the next book that I read for October was Pachinko by Jin Lee. This book was very interesting, very insightful, very emotionally captivating. It is a story of a Korean family that is living during the time of the Japanese occupation of Korea. So we get to follow them as they struggle financially in Korea during the war, as they move to Japan for better opportunities, and as they struggle in Japan under ostracization, and also eventually finding their way in society and still dealing with the shadow of occupation even generations after. And I also started this book in my readathon, so if you want some of my beginning thoughts on this book, which I really enjoyed the beginning, so you can check that out as well. So in the story, we are following Sunja and her mother. We essentially start from her parents, Yang Jin and Huni, who are living in Busan, and we get Sunja, and she is a young woman who ends up pregnant by a Yakuza man, and through many different choices and circumstances, she gets to marry a man who will give her child a surname, and through that relationship she ends up moving to Japan to live as Koreans, with her husband being a reverend, and we follow their family life in Japan essentially from that moment onwards. And this family faces a lot of struggles even before Sunja was born, and as you can imagine, this is around the time of the war, so not only financial struggles but like actually losing your life through violence, the struggles that exist from poverty to injustice based on your culture to being a foreigner in a country. Things of that nature are explored in such a beautiful way in this book, and you really get to know and understand the characters and why they are the way that they are. So we obviously have Hansu, who is the Yakuza man, and he really is someone who is a complicated character, but I genuinely enjoyed his character, and there were some moments where understandably a lot is put up against him, but I feel like he was a pretty standout character for me. And you also have Sunja and her 2 sons, Noah and Moses, and we get to understand the effect of growing up as a foreigner and living your whole life in a country but still being viewed as external and expendable and unimportant and dangerous and criminal in a country when you speak the language, where you write in the language, where you're more fluent in the culture than the one where you supposedly belong. And this book really puts up the question of what is a homeland and what is the idea of identity and statehood and belonging. It brings to questions of like language and culture and what really makes someone a countryman, what makes someone belong, what makes someone a patriot. This book was written in a very readable way. I feel like we explored a lot of great emotional depths in terms of like romance and pain and love and sorrow and loss. But the writing was incredibly easy to get through, very captivating. There were definitely some moments where I felt like the emotional background and the aftermath could have been explained a bit more, but in terms of the writing, it was super easy to get through, and honestly I just wanted to keep on reading and reading. And this book, honestly, like, it was very believable. I am obviously not 100% familiar with the history of the occupation in Korea, but there's so much that I learned about. I didn't know that North Korea was occupied by Russia and South Korea by America after the war. Those are certain things that I had no idea. So in terms of historical context, I think that this book was great and such a learning tool. So I definitely enjoyed the understanding I gained from it. And one thing that I genuinely enjoyed in this book was the theme of vulnerability. I feel like it followed quite nicely in the book, was just the vulnerability we witnessed through the characters and the situations that they had been through. It was a very honest and beautiful book to read. So overall, I gave this book 4 stars. I just don't think it was at the level of being a 5-star for me, but it was still a very interesting and a very important read. So that is it. That is all that I read for October, even though I didn't read all of it in October. Those were the books that I selected to read in October, so I'm just adding everything in there. Overall, I thought it was a very interesting month, very difficult, a lot of long books that I read, but I enjoyed that, and I think I'm definitely reading a lot more shorter, easier books this month just to combat that. Thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, please comment down below what your favorite read in October was, and I will catch you in the next one. Bye!